So, first, I'd like to thank you all for coming. And the talk that I'm giving today will be the last talk for today, and that is lucky for you. I know that after Christoph's talk, everybody wants to go home, and that is understandable. I assure you the talk that I'm about to give is even worse than his talk, but I appreciate you coming here anyway. And my talk is also kind of easier than some of the other talks. So many of the other talks were very technical and challenging, and this is on a lighter topic. It's a nice way to end the day, I hope. And so I'll get started. So my talk is titled Redefining BCIs. And this is an issue that keeps coming up in the BCI field, is new terms and definitions involving BCIs. And there was a paper that came out just last month that had a lot of big authors on it that tried to broaden the definition. And so that's what I will talk about today. And you see that my name is Brendan Allison with the Cognitive Science Department at UC San Diego. And I mentioned there my webpage and some other material. And you see also below there are a few plugs from me. So there is first a picture of Christoph and Gunther Edlinger. I mentioned the Brain.io Hackathon. You can see that logo there. And at the bottom, please note that there is the annual BCI Research Award. Every year there is such an award, and this year submissions are not it's kind of too early for it, but you can check that out on their webpage. So to move on, here is the long established BCI definition. So this has been around for a long time, that BCIs have three essential components. They have to read directly from the brain, they must provide feedback to the user, and they must operate in near real time. And I developed this figure. This figure is in progress, so don't worry about it too much. But I'm trying to represent these three components with a Venn diagram. So these are all components of the definition. You have to provide feedback directly to the user, analyze data in real time, or at least in near real time, and read directly from the brain. And all of these are types of neurotechnologies. So this was a slide that I checked with Christoph first. I said, so you want to redefine BCIs? And so my message in big red letters is, if you want to redefine BCIs, don't do it. Everybody keeps trying to do it. It's not a new issue. And a lot of this talk will describe the problems with it. So that is my four-letter word, don't. Perhaps other four-letter words might be appropriate, but not necessarily in this talk. And so for the rest of this talk, I'll provide some examples of why this matters. You know, who cares about the definition of a BCI? Why should we worry about it? Why is it worth discussing at all, or giving a talk, or listening to a talk? And another consideration is, what are the different ways that you can redefine a BCI? What are some approaches that can be used? And then I have some comments and predictions at the end. So one reason is that your new definition probably won't get adopted, right? A lot of people have said, hey, let's make up a new way to define BCIs. It's probably not going to catch on. Your clever definition will add what you want to do, but also much more. In other words, you will succeed in adding what you do to the definition. And of course, that's the reason you're trying to redefine BCIs. You want to add what you do. Right now, what you do is not considered a BCI, but you want to add that. But you'll also add much more. And your new definition will cause trouble. And I'll elaborate on this over the next several slides. So, like many talks, sometimes it's important to explain why this issue matters. Who cares what's a BCI or what isn't a BCI? Well, there are many reasons. One is that unclear terminology can waste time. It requires time for corrections. So there are, papers and posters and talks and things, and they use the term BCI incorrectly, or like I said, they even try to redefine it in a new way. It requires time to correct those things, and corrections can mean things like writing a paper or giving a follow-up talk or whatever. It will detract from the main purpose of your talk. If you're trying to present a new system and you want the attention to be on your innovation, your new idea, your new results, you probably don't want people focusing on minor petty issues regarding the definition. And of course, you need time for clarifications. Oh, well, when I said that my computer mouse is a BCI, this is what I meant. No, a mouse or a keyboard is not a BCI, and I'll get to that later in the talk. And of course, you have time for arguments. So arguing wastes time. It's not the greatest use of your time. And once again, it will draw people away from the other things you are trying to communicate. If you say, we have this new system to help people walk again, or help people communicate, or use a prosthetic limb, you don't want to waste time arguing about what exactly that is. And there have already been a lot of workshops and symposia and similar events to discuss this topic. What is a BCI? What does it mean? Why do we care? So more such activities will only further waste time. And you have a lot of irrelevant papers and conferences. So what this means is people will come out with papers and say, oh, look what I did. I have this new type of cell phone. It's a BCI. No, it's not. You might waste time going to the wrong conferences and such. So there are two main recurring conference series in the field that are devoted just to BCIs and have been occurring for many years. One is the BCI conference series in Graz, and the other is the BCI meeting series. The next one will be in June of this year in Banff, Canada. And those are no longer the only conference series. So there are lots of other ones. As you probably know, IEEE Brain has relevant conferences and so on. And for all of these things, it matters what you're doing. If you go to a conference, you want to know what kind of material will be presented there, what kinds of people will be there, what kinds of devices and systems you can see, and so on. Also, unclear terminology can create fragmentation. That is, you have people going around and disagreeing and even splitting off into different groups. And so there was some of this earlier, and unfortunately there always will be, with the implanted community and the non-implanted community. So some people have said, oh, well, only an invasive or implanted system is a BCI, and others might say that with respect to non-invasive approaches. And neither of these are true. From the early days, both of these are considered BCIs. And of course, I don't think many people here in this audience disagree. That is, most of the work that's been presented and is being presented does in fact relate to a BCI. But again, there are other groups out there. Not only does it create fragmentation, but it conveys fragmentation. What I mean by that is that it sends the message to other people, to other scientists, to doctors, to journalists, and others. I have a list of them soon, that the field is fragmented, that we don't get along, that everybody is, arguing over terms. And in large part, this isn't true. That is, at least, when I go to the BCI meetings and BCI conferences, everybody is very friendly. It's nice to see everybody. Of course, it's nice to see Christoph Guger, especially because he now likes gin and tonics. And so that makes him much more fun than he used to be. He's still not very fun. Christoph Guger is still a very serious man, but I hang out with him anyway because I have bad judgment. Unclear terminology can also confuse people, and I'll provide a list of such people over the next slides, where there are a lot of different people who say, well, what is a BCI? I don't even understand. And so these are some people to whom this definition matters: scientists, engineers, and doctors. So these three categories are the sorts of people who often participate in master classes, who give talks, who interact with non-experts about BCIs. I know many people who are watching this either now or perhaps later on elsewhere might be students or other people. But even still, a lot of you are in one of these categories or studying to be one of these people. And in general, yes, scientists, engineers, and doctors are often concerned about words and what they mean. In addition, a lot of other examples include funding agencies. So this is a very big one. And I'm talking, remember, about who cares about the definition of BCIs. Well, a lot of the work that you've seen here today is based on public funding. In other words, the European Commission or an entity in the US or some other country will provide money so that you can work on BCIs. And as many of you know, GTEC has been very active with public funding. It's had dozens of projects over the years, and some of these projects were helpful toward key GTEC products. So examples like RecoverX and CortiQ and MindBeagle, all of these resulted in part from funding from the European Commission based on a grant proposal. So somebody wrote a grant proposal, and in those examples, it was me, but GTEC has had a lot of other proposals that were successful independent of me. And if a funding agency says we want to provide 200 million euros for BCIs, of course it's important what a BCI is. If I go in and I say, hey, I have a special type of eye tracker and it doesn't record directly from the brain, but it's a brain-computer interface, you don't want those people to get money for BCI funding. They have their own funding. And this is not a hypothetical problem. So in fact, in 2010, I started a project led, by me through TU Graz that was requested, by the European Commission. They said, we're seeking proposals for projects that will clarify what is a BCI and what isn't a BCI, so that we, the European Commission, can direct our funding accordingly. In other words, they reported that that was a problem. They see these proposals come in and they say, hey, we would like millions of euros from the European Commission to develop a BCI. And the reviewers would say, well, I don't think this is a BCI, but I'm not sure. And so that's, of course, a noteworthy issue for you if you want funding from the European Commission or from anywhere. Also, another entity is regulatory agencies. So if you make laws or regulations or guidelines or standards, this also matters. And as you know, IEEE has a standards entity. They had a panel in 2020 and came out with a paper in 2021 defining what a BCI is. And this was not a redefinition, it was just using the same terms and clarifications as previous work. But the fact that this happened within the last 5 years from a big organization like IEEE shows that these kinds of things matter. And similarly with IEEE, for them, they're very concerned with what is the definition of an electrical or electronic engineer. Since those are 3 of the E's in IEEE, it's important to know what they mean. And then regulatory agencies pay attention to these decisions from IEEE and from the BCI Society and others. So entities like the Food and Drug Administration in the United States need to know what a BCI is, what is or isn't a BCI, because this affects a lot of rules and guidelines. There are some famous examples of mistakes with this. It's not a major point here. You can look them up online. For example, if you type the tariffs with fruit, plants versus fruit plants, there's a huge difference. So there used to be a law that says all foreign fruit plants are exempt from tariffs. A fruit plant is obviously a type of plant that produces fruit, but someone added a comma mistakenly and it became fruit, comma, plants. And that means all fruits and all plants are exempt from tariffs. And that cost the United States government more than 10 million US dollars because all of a sudden a lot of people did not have to pay tariffs. That's a minor example of what a definition can do, or maybe not so minor. That's a lot of money. Of course, they matter to lawyers. So just like scientists and engineers and doctors from the last slide, lawyers are another group that are often very concerned with words and what they mean. So what if this becomes an issue in court? There's a lawsuit, there's a decision for an insurance company or something. These issues matter. Another big group that cares about this are journalists. So this is another concern that's been brought up many times in the BCI community and by me, that you see a lot of articles come out about BCIs that are not very good. And the journalists did not really make an effort to understand what the system is. And often they're just not BCIs. So they'll talk about systems that where maybe one person told them it's a BCI. And this could be a big problem. Let's say an article comes out tomorrow and says somebody dies from using a BCI, and everybody gets scared and they don't want to use BCIs and they don't trust Christoph Guger anymore, and nobody wants to buy electrode caps. And maybe the article isn't about a BCI at all. Maybe it's one of those systems that stimulates your brain so that you stay awake all night or something. Well, that kind of thing matters. That, like I said, that feedback would affect a lot of different groups. It would be bad for the field, and you're not going to see a lot of corrections. I mean, you'll see me trying. I'll say, hey, you made a mistake in your article and please fix it. And the journalist will say, and nothing will happen. Certainly they matter to companies. So if you're a company that sells BCIs, then you want to have a good definition of it. Your customers are going around online. They might be doing a search for which companies sell BCIs. You want them to find your company, and you don't want them to find companies that sell non-BCI systems. And of course, students. So I mentioned in the last slide, a lot of people who are here watching the MasterClass, either right now or at the recording later, are students. They might someday become scientists, engineers, or doctors. They might also someday work with any of the other groups here. They might become lawyers or journalists. They might work for a company or start a company. And so that matters. Just yesterday, I was talking with a professor at UC San Diego, Virginia Dessa, about teaching some new BCI classes at UCSD. So I taught the first BCI class at UCSD. In fact, I taught the first BCI class ever. The first time anyone taught a class about BCIs, that was me. And now the cognitive science department has a devoted class to that. That is, there's a class called CogSci 189, Brain-Computer Interfaces, and it's heavily impacted. So they have 200 students and they have to turn away students. And so we were talking about, well, why don't we have new classes about BCIs? And so then that matters. If you're a student and you want to take a class in anything, if you want to take a class in organic chemistry, you want to make sure it's actually teaching organic chemistry and that it meets your expectations. Professors care for a lot of the same reasons as students. If you teach a class, you want to know what it is. You want other people to know what it is. And another reason this matters is redefining BCIs is insulting. A lot of people have worked on this term for a long time. It's mean to the prior papers and authors. Textbooks, so there are different very good textbooks devoted to BCIs. One is Walpaugh and Walpaugh 2012, and we're working on an updated version. So I just sent in a while ago, I sent in a chapter about BCIs for the general population with my co-author, Reinhold Shearer, who is also an old friend and colleague. And there's another excellent textbook from Chang Nam and Fabian Lott and their colleagues. And those textbooks, of course, also define BCIs. They're meant for a certain audience. And so if you buy a textbook, you want it to provide the information that you expect. Of course, it's bad for teachers and students. So a lot of teachers and students are involved with BCI classes. And if you're going to say, oh, well, a BCI is now something different, that's problematic for them. Maybe in the future, employers will say, we wanted to hire someone who knows about BCIs, but it looks like you didn't take the right classes or something. Not good. And of course, funded projects. So I mentioned a project that I led called the Future BNCI Project that was devoted to that. There was a follow-up project called BNCI Horizon 2020. I'll present both of these later in my talk that address the definition and why it's important. And these projects were a lot of effort. They were a lot of work. Each of them was a 2-year-long project. The projects were not only devoted to defining BCI, obviously that shouldn't take 2 years and a crew of experts, but those were partial goals, were among the goals of the project. Focus groups. So a lot of us have had groups where we sit around and say, well, what are the essential features of a BCI? Does it have to be something that provides feedback to the user? Does it have to operate in real time or near real time? And what exactly do we mean by near real time, and so on? Surveys. So we've had publications that survey people, survey BCI people at one of the BCI meetings, for example, to ask them about the definition and essential features of a BCI. Members of the BCI Society. So the BCI Society developed a definition last year, and to do that, they created a committee that included Reinhold Scherer and others that then created a vote for the members, and the members voted, and they could have voted for different definitions, but the definition that they voted on was pretty much the one that I showed earlier, the same one that's been used in the field for decades. And at that time, that reflected the membership of the society, which was 445 people. So that's a lot of people. As BCIs grow, the society will grow, but still that's a decent sized group. And so many more. And I'll move on from that. Also, definitions and words matter to patients and potential patients. This is a very important group. So as I mentioned, what if you're thinking about using a BCI because you need one? You need one to communicate, or you need one to move a prosthetic arm. And like I said, you see an article on the front page of the newspaper or on a website or something, and it says, oh no, somebody died from BCI syndrome or something. And it turns out the article was not about a BCI. The journalist got it wrong, but still you decide, no, I don't want to use a BCI. I don't trust these things. Similarly, families of them and the public at large could also care. So over the next several slides, I'll present some examples of work that has tried to define BCIs. And when I was compiling this, I stopped about 10 years ago. And the reason is, in the last 10 years, there's just been so much more. I didn't want to get into it too much, and the talk would become too long. So I will provide some examples in the last 10 years. I already mentioned the IEEE definition and the BCI Society definition, but at least in terms of the slides, these are examples from sort of the early days. Many of you know that the first paper about BCIs was from Jacques Vidal in 1973. And this paper was the first peer-reviewed publication that presented a BCI, and it also introduced the term BCI and the acronym BCI. So before 1973, nobody used the term brain-computer interface, and nobody had the acronym BCI, at least not to my knowledge. If anybody knows, if you can find a prior example, please tell me, and I will say that I'm sorry, and I will blame it on Christoph Guger, even though it's my fault. And in that paper, Vidal did not really define BCI. The paper was titled Toward Brain-Computer Communication, and it wasn't really concerned with the definition. I did meet Jacques Vidal and his wife, Larice, who was his research assistant, and I discussed this with him, and he said, yeah, we like the established definition, the one from the Furtscheller 2010 paper, which had some clarifications, but that wasn't the main goal of his paper. The main goal of his paper was to present a system and not a definition. The first review article about BCIs was from Andrea Kubler and colleagues. Many of you may be familiar with her work. She's been a giant in the field, very, very active. Unfortunately, unlike Jacques and Larice Vidal. So after their initial work, they had another paper in 1977, and then more of a theory paper in 1998. They were not really active in the field. But Andrea Kubler has been. You may be familiar with brain painting and other work from her. And her definition is that it's a system that translates the electrical activity of the brain into systems controlling external devices. And notice this does not have a lot of components of the canonical definition. For example, it never mentions the real-time nature of it nor the feedback, but it does emphasize that it's translating activity of the brain into signals. In other words, it's a device that reads from the brain. And the next year, a review article came out from Walpa and colleagues. And even today, it is the most heavily cited article in the BCI literature. So if you look online, it's been cited more than twice as much as any other paper about BCIs. Even though it's more than 20 years old, it still gets cited a lot, and it should. It doesn't just present the state of the field way back then, which has, of course, changed a lot. It also has a lot of attention to other issues, including practical and ethical issues that are still relevant today. And of course, Walpa is still very well known. I mentioned the textbook. Many people refer to him as the father of BCIs. He is still active in the field, even though he's certainly earned retirement if that's what he wanted to do. But we still see him and appreciate him. And in this article, he did actually care about the definition of a BCI. And you see here, this is the classic definition that many people have used. A BCI is a communication system in which messages or commands that an individual sends to the external world do not pass through the brain's normal output pathways of peripheral nerves and muscles. And so again, this has the key element of sending information from the brain somewhere else, and also emphasizes the direct component. In other words, devices that indirectly read brain activity are not BCIs. So for example, an eye tracker, an EMG switch, EOG, quite a lot of systems can be, you could say, well, that's reading the activity of the brain indirectly. I recently had an argument with someone who was saying, we have these devices that read EMG from the wrist so you can play computer games more quickly. Those are brain-computer interfaces. And I said, no, because they're not directly reading from the brain. And this is why I'm currently wearing a shirt that says, "We'll argue science for money," and wear that shirt often. Unfortunately, nobody's actually called me on it because of that shirt. So some people have seen the shirt and they say, "Nice shirt," or they ask whether it's a political statement. And again, if you want an answer to that, you'd have to pay me. Or they want to argue for free. And no, like, if you want to argue science, pay me. That's kind of what I'm doing right here in this talk. But of course, this is a different situation. Then 5 years later, we came out with the paper. This was my paper with both John and Liz Walpa that said a BCI is a communication system by which a person can send commands without using peripheral nerves or muscles. And so this is very similar to their definition from the 2002 paper, but we spent a lot more time on it. We had some clarification, and we even had a whole section called devices that are not BCIs. And we even talked about what are now called passive BCIs, as I mentioned there, and I'll get to that in the next couple slides. And notice on the bottom, we explicitly said systems that send signals to the brain are not BCIs. And this is because people were already trying to redefine BCIs to say they're devices that write to the brain. Now, to be clear, if a device writes to the brain and reads from the brain, that's a BCI. A BCI may be combined with other tools. That's called a hybrid BCI, which was introduced, I mentioned it in my thesis in 2003. They were called combined BCIs. And then the first big paper about that was Furtscheller et al. 2010, where we went into a lot more detail about different types of hybrid BCIs. So this is also noted in the BCI Society definition. There are a lot of bidirectional systems, and these can be BCIs as long as it reads directly from the brain and meets other components, it's a BCI. Then another definition that I just mentioned comes from Furtscheller et al. 2010. BCI monitors the user's brain activity and translates their intentions into commands without activating any peripheral muscle or peripheral nerve. And you note that we have 4 criteria. Direct, we mentioned that. We also have the 2 elements of real-time processing and feedback. We were trying to develop a firewall against redefining BCIs, but you see that's changed since then. And in fact, here is a picture of me hanging out with Torsten Zander. So passive BCIs have become quite prominent and popular now. But back at the time, like for example, if you look at the earlier work before then, these passive approaches were not considered BCIs. And also Torsten Zander gets credit for developing that term, passive BCI. That's a good way to think of him. And you may also know he's having a conference in April in Berlin. And so I would encourage you to check that out. Next was the Future BNCI project from 2010 to 2012. This was an EU-funded project that I mentioned. And we basically said we like the definition from Furtscheller et al. 2010. So that was part of why we came out with that paper, although we went beyond just the definition and we also talked about hybrid BCIs. I was working for Gert Furtscheller at the time. That's why he got to be first author. Even though the paper was my idea, I conceived it, I wrote it, and I turned it to him pretty much ready to go. And I'll let you ponder that one for a bit. And the next big definition was from Walpa and Walpa 2012. And he said a BCI is a system that measures CNS activity and converts it into artificial output that replaces, restores, enhances, supplements, or improves natural CNS output, and thereby changes the ongoing interactions between the CNS and its internal or external environment. And the next one and the last one that I have a slide for was the BNCI Horizon 2020 project. And that says a BCI is a communication device which allows people to control applications through direct measures of their brain activity. This is also something that was funded by the European Commission and more or less kept other elements of the definition. There was a lot more work in that definition. This isn't all of it. And if you want, you can look online and find a roadmap that they produced if you just type either of the project names from this slide or the last slide. We also came out with a book, Allison et al. 2013, Towards Practical BCIs. But again, you can find that online, so I won't go into it further here. So in the next part, and this is completely new, so nobody's seen this, the material I presented before is, of course, published work. You can find it. I've never presented this section before. And what I did is, in reviewing these different papers and works, approaches to redefining BCI, I started noticing some patterns. That is, there are different ways that people came up with a justification. They said, hey, let's change the definition of a BCI and this is why it needs to change. Well, to start with is the approach that has been prominent for a long time, which I call canonical. And again, these are all new words, and not like I made up the word period, but it's a new application of this word to this phenomenon. And that just means you can look at BCIs in terms of what systems have and haven't been called BCIs based on over 25 years of prior activity. So, for example, and this could be a great task for an academic who wants to develop this further. You can study this. I'm making a public talk. You might say, oh, Brendan's wrong, and I've found other examples, but I think that in general, you'll find the same thing that I've found. Most of the publications that describe BCIs meet the 3 criteria that I presented earlier in my talk and have been presented across most definitions. Most peer-reviewed publications, including books and journal papers, if something says this is a BCI, then it meets those criteria. Whereas things that don't meet those criteria are generally not presented as BCIs. The same with conferences. So if you look at the BCI meetings and BCI conferences, most of the papers, talks, posters, workshops, and other things there that are about BCIs are the same types of systems I've just mentioned. Workshops within those conferences, lectures, not just in conferences, but in talks and things. Posters, not just at the BCI meeting, but at the Society for Neuroscience and IEEE and others. Products, of course, this is of interest to Gugger Technologies. That is, most things that companies call BCIs, again, with some worrisome exceptions with people trying to broaden the field, but most of them are BCIs. BCI classes, again, what they're teaching about are things that are considered BCIs according to this canonical definition and the definition I presented at the beginning. And finally, practitioners. So if you look at people who call themselves BCI experts or labs that are called BCI labs and such, they tend to be systems that read directly from the brain, provide feedback to the user, and operate in near real time. They have those 3 criteria, whereas BCI, or people that claim to be BCI labs or practitioners, are not prominent. In other words, the other types of systems are generally not presented as BCIs. So that's part of why I put canonical in green, is that's one good and reasonable way to define BCIs, aside from, of course, the explicit approach of, publishing something. And so this is from just over 25 years ago. This is the attendees of the first BCI meeting in 1999. This was held in Rensselaerville, New York. And you might think, where is everybody? I thought these BCI meetings had hundreds of people. They didn't, not back then. So back in 1999, there were about 40 people at the meeting. Yes, John Walpaugh is in there, and Christoph Gugger is there, and I'm there, and so on. And this is a great picture. It brings back memories, but I'm not going to get whimsical about it right now. And explicit, that's what I was just saying, consider earlier work that explicitly define BCIs. In other words, papers that say, these are what BCIs are, these are what BCIs aren't. And I even have a reminder of these 3 essential components. I'm not saying these are the only components, but these are 3 key defining features that BCIs have to have. Nominal. So this is an approach that is extremely popular in trying to broaden the definition of BCIs, and I'm going to rail against it for a while. And here's a phrase that you've probably heard of before. This is from Romeo and Juliet. The phrase is from 1597, and this is a picture of Romeo and Juliet from a 1968 version of it. No, I'm not an expert on Shakespeare or literature, and that's why I won't get too carried away with this, but we are talking about words and definitions, and I have a quote from Lewis Carroll coming up. So the approach here is, why don't we define or redefine BCIs based on the 3 words? Let's look at the name, the term brain-computer interface. And you say, well, my system provides an interface between a brain and a computer. And you notice whenever you're trying to redefine BCI, it's always to include what you do. It's always so you get money, you get publicity, you get fame. It's never like, hey, what about these other systems? So this approach seems logical, and maybe it seems insightful, but it's not. It's neither one. You are not coming up with anything clever, and it's certainly not insightful. It basically shows you haven't read prior literature and you haven't thought about it very much, have you? No, you haven't. So if you think about it just a little bit more, a keyboard or a mouse is an interface from a brain to a computer. Many things would be BCIs. If you're trying to say a BCI is anything that provides an interface between a brain and a computer, you're expanding the definition into meaninglessness. You are making a definition that doesn't help. It doesn't really narrow down what you want. I think most of us agree keyboards and mice are not BCIs. They may provide an interface from a brain to a computer, but that's not what we think about. Most of the talks here are not saying, hey, I have a new keyboard or a mouse. You could also say a monitor. It's providing an interface between a brain and a computer. In this case, it's a way to send information to your brain. But if you start saying, well, any system that bridges or interfaces a brain and a computer is a BCI, you're ruining the term. And so I've referred to this as BCI dilution and pollution, and that's where the nominal approach is going. It's just not as clever as you think. What you're basically doing is this mistake. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather a scornful tone, by the way, I'm using a scornful tone now, it's fun. It means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. So this is from Lewis Carroll, who was a famous author, of course. And that's kind of my mockery of the nominal approach to redefining BCI. They're trying to say, well, let's say that a BCI just means what I want it to mean. Of course, you can't do that. Of course, if you're trying to be specific in terms of laws and regulations and funding and things like that, you can't just say something means what I choose it to mean. It has to mean something more intelligent than that. Taxonomic. So this is another way to try to define or redefine BCIs that's not necessarily problematic. So you say, let's categorize BCIs based on features like invasiveness or the mental activities used for control. And notice I use the word categorize, in other words, not necessarily define, the neural signal types, the goal or the purpose of the BCI. And over the next few slides, I have examples of the first of these, the first 4 of those, or any component. So could we categorize BCIs based on what signal processing they use or what type of output device they use? Well, sure you can. Another one is synchronicity. So can you categorize BCIs based on whether they are synchronous BCIs or asynchronous BCIs? Sure, that's useful. And this is also potentially a good way to police what types of systems are different categories of BCIs. So there's no problem with this per se, as long as it still follows the established BCI definition. In fact, it can be quite helpful. It's useful to not only define what BCIs are, but different types or categories of BCIs. And my next few slides have some examples of this. So a lot of people have tried to and succeeded in categorizing BCIs based on their invasiveness. So you might say, well, this is a non-invasive BCI, this is an invasive BCI. Other groups have used the term implanted. There are examples of terms like semi-invasive or minimally invasive. And One example of this is from Eric Luthart and colleagues in 2021. And this is a nice figure from their paper. I like their paper. Eric Luthart has been around in the field for quite a while. We used a similar approach in our paper last year, Schalk et al. 2024, in Nature Reviews Bioengineering. Also, you can look at the types of neural signals. So you can categorize BCIs based on what types of neural signals are used for control. This image here is from the aforementioned review article, Walpaugh et al. 2002, and you see that he presents 4 different types of BCIs based on slow cortical potentials, P300s, sensory motor rhythms, and cortical neuronal activity. And as I mentioned earlier, some things have changed. This paper is over 20 years old. The approach with slow cortical potentials, basically it was a stupid idea from the beginning. It succeeded as long as it did, which is not long after this paper, due to the extraordinary force of will from Niels Bierbaumer, but it's just a fundamentally flawed approach. It requires much more extensive training in other BCIs. It's very slow, as the word slow cortical potential conveys. It doesn't really provide more than 2 choices. And so you don't see a lot of such systems nowadays. I can't think, there's only one recent reference promoted by Bierbaumer and colleagues. Other than that, there is a paper called Nessie et al. 2007. I don't know any serious labs that work on them, again, aside from Niels Bierbaumer, who considers himself serious. Also notice that this doesn't mention SSVEPs or CVEPs or other such approaches, which are now pretty prominent. And that's kind of unfortunate. The first paper from Vidal in 1973 used that, but nonetheless, they weren't used in this categorization back in 2002. You can also organize BCIs by their goal or purpose. So this is an image from Walpaugh 2012. And I mentioned that they used an approach that I call the riser model. And I know Walpaugh liked that term. That was just an abbreviation for restore, improve, supplement, enhance, replace. So these are the 5 types of goals that a BCI can have according to this textbook. And I know Walpaugh and colleagues are working on an updated version. As I mentioned, Reini Scherer and I sent in a chapter for that. And so I'm very excited about it. I look forward to seeing the rest of this book that they're developing. And there are a lot of other possibilities for how you can represent things taxonomically. So I'm not going to go into all of them. But if you're interested in this, then the following slide might be of interest, which is from a paper called Mason et al. 2007. And this, I unfortunately could not get a hold of Steve Mason. I tried, but this is a co-author from that paper, Melody Moore Jackson. I just talked to her, where we've been trying to pin Steve down, but no luck. This is only one page of their BCI taxonomy. So you see in table 1, it says design taxonomy, and they list all these design attributes. These are different attributes of a BCI that could be used to categorize different BCIs. So you see, for example, you could look at the target population, the target activity. This is a little bit like the goal or purpose, the target environment. I won't go over all of them, but this was a nice paper. It was a very long paper, a lot of work. And in addition to this, they had further pages with taxonomy terms and definitions. Another argument for redefining BCIs is financial. So this is basically saying we should expand the definition because then more money will be available from various sources. And this is kind of the argument of having a bigger pie. So these sources include public funding, sales, service fees, and insurance. This is not an exclusive list, so there are other ways that you can get more money. And this sounds kind of appealing, like, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could get more money for BCIs? Well, why don't we make a bigger pie, and then you can get a bigger piece of the pie. However, this has a rather obvious problem, which is that if you're expanding the definition, if you're trying to say, let's make BCIs include things that interact with the brain indirectly, because then we get more funding, then you also have more people who want that pie, more people and bigger people. So if you do that, more and bigger people and entities are competing for that money. Some of you may recall this scene from Stand By Me, which is based on a book by Stephen King. And this is a pie eating contest. And the details of it are not important. There are worse images I could have presented than this one. But do you want to go up in a pie eating contest against a particularly fat person who's really good at eating pie? That's kind of my problem with the financial argument. So, imagine you get a bigger pie to share, but first you have bigger people eating it, and second, you have a lot more people trying to eat it. So ultimately, your slice of the pie will not be that much bigger and may very well be smaller. And never mind the fact that that's a rather circuitous argument for why you should redefine BCI. You're not saying we should do it because of some fundamental characteristic of BCIs or the field. We should just do it as an excuse to get more money. That's kind of cheating. And I also have another quote, an example from another famous person: make the pie higher. So that's kind of what the argument is. If you're not a good English speaker and that doesn't seem to make sense to you, you haven't made a mistake. That is grammatically and semantically incorrect. The sentence doesn't really make sense, but you kind of understand what he means. Make a bigger pie, but then, like I said, you get a smaller piece of that pie. Yet another example is based on growth. That is, the definition of BCI should grow because we want to show that the field is growing. With great frustration, I don't mention who specifically said that. But that's, of course, a particularly silly argument to me. So if you take the same structure, you say, we want to show that more cars are sold each year, so we will expand the definition of cars to include trucks. So some people may think that trucks are cars, and arguably they are, but you need to have a consistent definition. Motorcycles, are motorcycles cars? Not really. They're related, they're motor vehicles. What about tricycles? I don't think tricycles are considered cars by anyone that I know of. Most tricycles do not have a motor, and they're ridden by little kids, and they don't require insurance and all kinds of other things. Drones, yeah, now we're getting pretty far away from cars. So drones are really not cars. But again, that's the same type of argument, is why don't we keep expanding the definition of BCI to show that the field is growing? What about kittens? I don't know what kittens think of this. I have not surveyed kittens. I would guess that neither kittens nor adult cats consider themselves cars, but I'm not sure. And finally, Christoph Guger. So is Christoph Guger a car? No, Christoph Guger is not a car. I'm pretty sure about that. I have the t-shirt that says, we'll argue science for money, and if you give me money, I will make more intelligent and emphatic arguments about why Christoph Guger is not a car. Christoph Guger is probably listening, and if he considers himself a car, he may disagree. And then if he pays me, I'll argue with him. And Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty is not a car. You can see I can get increasingly ridiculous on this point, and I already have with the last few examples, but I think that's a reasonable portrayal of this growth-based argument. And another justification for expanding the term is inclusivity. So we want to avoid hurt feelings. We don't want anyone to feel excluded. Part of the problem with this is that it also sounds very nice. In many ways, society is making a shift toward inclusion in other ways that is nice, that involves reduction of prejudice and making people feel welcome who deserve to feel welcome because they're people. But the word inclusivity can mean a lot of different things. And in terms of not making people feel excluded, that's not really the best argument. So I've had many discussions with this with a great guy and researcher here. And if you take the same argument structure, well, can I present BCI posters at conferences for dentistry? So let's say I went to a conference of dentists and I said, hey, I want to present my BCI work. And they said, no, you can't because that's not dentistry. And I said, oh, I feel excluded. Same thing with Sanskrit or basket weaving or male bovine fecal management. So let's say I go and I say, hey, you guys are experts in managing male bovine feces, in other words, bullshit, and I want to present BCIs here. They'll say, no, you can't. This conference is devoted to bullshit, and BCIs are not that. And I say, oh, I feel excluded. Well, that's unlikely. I don't plan on such conferences, but you get the idea. And getting near the end of this is the fatalistic type of argument, which is that BCIs will be misinterpreted no matter what. And John Calvin was a very famous fatalist. And you see that Bill Waterston, of course, had his famous Calvin and Hobbes cartoon from that. This is an example of that. If we insist on a very narrow definition, then who is in charge of correcting every journalist, CEO, inventor, and cab driver that what they're talking about isn't technically a BCI? Will they change how they communicate even if we try to correct them? And this is from the first author of a recent paper that tried to broaden the definition of BCI. What do you know? The new definition of BCI that would be broadened would include the systems that Jacob Robinson is trying to sell through his company Motif, whereas the current definition would not. So I mentioned that as a key feature. People keep wanting to broaden the definition to promote the systems they develop or sell so they make more money, and that's problematic. Well, here's the same type of fatalistic argument structure. Some BCIs will be misused no matter what. Therefore, we shouldn't bother with things like laws or standards or ethics groups or enforcement of laws, safety warnings and training, and so on. And the fatalistic argument does have some basis in truth. That is, I've already mentioned there have been a lot of problems with journalists and other people, including funding entities, that do not really understand what a BCI is and need to be corrected on that. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. And need to be corrected over and over. But that's not an argument for not trying in the first place. And finally, for this part and getting toward the end of my talk, there are certain common elements in efforts to redefine BCIs. They're usually by people who are new to BCIs, at least partly. They always want to broaden the definition, and tell me if you can find an exception. I couldn't find a single example of someone who says we want a narrower definition. They always want to broaden it, and they always wanted to broaden it so that it includes something that they do. There is inadequate attention to existing definitions, and it always has side effects that they didn't consider. In particular, it includes more systems than they expect, especially the so-called nominal redefinition approach, and they don't think about fragmentation in the field or other damage that they're causing to people like Christoph and me and all of our beloved colleagues. So the last part, I have some predictions. Unfortunately, I predict that BCIs themselves, and hence the term BCI, will continue getting more popular and profitable and powerful. and therefore more ubiquitous. That is, you're going to see more and more people using BCIs, primarily patient groups, but you're seeing a slow increase in adoption with healthy users as well. And then a lot of people are looking at healthy users as sort of a universal group, and that's sort of missing the point. For example, one major group that's growing is for people for education. So Christoph has mentioned his education kit, and a lot of universities and other educational entities now have classes devoted to BCIs. Well, these are mostly healthy user groups. Most of the instructors and students are healthy people, but they're not representative of other healthy people in that they have a unique interest in wanting to learn and use BCIs. So you see a big increase in purchases and usage of BCIs among that part of the healthy user population. And consistent with what I've said before, redefinitions without broad support can lead to backlash or bad publicity when something that's mislabeled as a BCI causes harm. This is unfortunately a real problem in the field. There have been a lot of misdirected attacks on BCI practitioners, not just me. I have received credible death threats, and this is an underappreciated issue. And that's why I put it in big and red, and I'm glad to get this out publicly. This isn't just me. I can name a lot of other people who have been contacted by people who think that there's a device implanted in their brain that's controlling them from the government or something, that we're responsible somehow, that we put it there, that we have the power to get it out. That's just not true. There was a recent paper from the aforementioned Nick Ramsey and Mariska van Steensel noting that the number of people who have had implanted BCI systems is less than 100. There just aren't that many implanted BCIs out there right now. And in any case, there are not implanted BCIs that do the sorts of things that they are afraid are happening. Also, there are a lot of alternate terms for BCIs, and this isn't new. This is over 20 years ago. You see that I created a list of them with references dating back before then. A lot of people are trying to talk about what a BCI is, or not a BCI, but a BCI-like system. A lot of people have presented terms. A lot of them are good terms. This is one of the fundamental problems with BCI is, like I said, from a nominal perspective, it could mean anything. But these alternate terms will probably have the same problems. People will think, aha, this means exactly what it's supposed to mean. This means what I say it means. And other people will say, no, it means something different. And this gets back to the Humpty Dumpty example. And other people will do the same thing. They'll say, you say neural device driver or mental prosthesis or whatever. Well, this could mean lots of things, just like BCI. So is there a happy ending to this? So this has not been my most hopeful talk, but I'm only rather bleak about the definition. That will continue being an issue for squabbling and trouble. Overall, I'm hopeful about BCIs in many ways. I also just added these last two slides at the last minute because Christoph asked me to. So this is Christoph Guger's fault. No, if you thought I was going to give you another type of happy ending, that's not what I meant. Shame on you. Christoph Guger is not either. Christoph might give you a hug. He might shake your hand. But yeah. So finally, I'd like to thank GTEC for hosting me. Thank you all for listening. And if you want more stuff from me, I have been working on a YouTube channel. I also have this website devoted to BCI science fiction, and you're welcome to email me. So that concludes my talk, and I have no more slides, but I'm now going to check on questions. Recent efforts, yes. So the acceptability of BCIs, this is a question I was asked. I think this is also a very underappreciated challenge in the field. That is, many people don't appreciate that there will and perhaps should be a lot of concern about BCIs being deployed in workplace environments and in other sort of casual settings where you're using a BCI not because there's a medical need, but rather because someone told you to. So if you're using it for a game or you're using it for creative expression, you're using it for art or whatever, then that's different. Then you're voluntarily choosing to use a BCI. But there's a whole different category if it's part of work, like if you're required to use it. So, for example, with alertness monitoring, there's a company called WEMCO, and I heard they did a large-scale trial with people for an alertness monitoring system for miners and mining. And so the problem that they encountered is a lot of people said, well, wait a second, I don't want to put this thing on my head that measures brain activity. And the work from that you mentioned from Brevet and colleagues, they were looking at that primarily in the context of motor rehab after stroke. However, there are a lot of different other applications for it. Like motor rehab is also a somewhat more voluntary example. You're not doing it because your boss told you to do it. You choose to go through that motor rehabilitation. But again, if your boss says you have to use a system for for alertness monitoring, or you can't have a job, well, that's a concern. And a lot of people have talked about alertness monitoring or error monitoring or things like that for military applications, for manufacturing. So WEMCO is looking at it for mining, where there really is a practical need for safety. People, unfortunately, do still die from mining accidents. Where I live in Colorado, it's a town with 900 people. And very unfortunately, several years ago, two local miners died. There is mining nearby, and two miners died in part, well, not in part, but because of a safety problem. They were trapped in a certain area. And I see that Alex from GTEC wants to answer this question, so I'll pause and let him speak. But again, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take other questions.
No, sorry, Brandon, I don't want to answer it, but I only clicked that it's getting answered from your side right now.
Okay, then yeah, I have, I guess, 3 minutes left before the end of my scheduled time. So if you, Alex, have questions or anyone else. Also, a quick comment is in the chat. I see that Erica Mondria from Ars Electronica Center in Linz was talking about BCIs in science fiction. So I think that's also a great, exciting, interesting direction, and I'm happy to discuss it more. Again, I have this webpage, BiFi, which is like sci-fi, but with BCI instead. And it doesn't just have a lot of stories, it has examples of other studies of BCI science fiction, other articles about it, other examples of it. But certainly Erica is very qualified to discuss and present it further. There's another question. What does the term brain-machine teaming learn? I'm actually not sure. That's a new one to me. It might refer to collaborative use of brain-machine interfaces or BCIs, such as hyperscanning from GTEC, but I don't know.
I never heard this as well so far, but there could be. Yeah, if there are no further questions, then thank you, Brandon, for your presentation.